Welcome back to the Making Space podcast. I can't believe it. We are back for season 3. And if you tuned in to this past season, you'll know that the goal of this podcast is to help you as a leader to see the influence that physical spaces, both within church buildings and outside of those church spaces, the impact that they can have on the formation of our faith, emotion, thoughts, and behavior. Here in season 3, I'm joined by my returning co-host, Jay Kim, and I'm going to introduce in just a moment our new co-host, our third co-host. But firstly, Jay, welcome back for season 3.
We're back, Benjamin, and we had a guest in a previous season that was so good. She's joining us now to host the show and raise the bar.
That's fantastic.
I thought it was just mutiny.
It's, of course, all of the above.
That's right.
Sarah Joy Propay runs a church consulting business called the Proximity Project. Sarah Joy, welcome. We are so glad to have you on board, and we would love just to quickly hear a little bit about the Proximity Project.
Yeah, it's so great to be here and to be invited to be a part of this podcast. I'm excited to get to know y'all. I'm the new kid on the block this season, so a lot to learn from everything that you all have to offer and from our guests. But a little bit about me. I run a church consulting business, as you said, Proximity Project. And really, this is a business that's focused on educating and activating churches to be stewards of their property through avenues of placemaking and real estate development. And a lot of people hear placemaking, that feels kind of like, industry jargon, but placemaking is really the art of transforming public spaces into places for social connection and community building. So with churches, that takes the shape of walking paths, gardens, even dog parks, those kind of things. So I have a lot of fun getting creative and thinking outside the box with church property, and then also helping them understand what's feasible in terms of real estate too. So that takes the shape of affordable housing projects, community spaces. So doing a lot of the boots on the ground, tangible work with churches and their property. So I think I'll learn a lot from some of our guests here on the podcast this season, hopefully.
Yeah, well, welcome, Sarah Joy. And wait, what? There are dog parks at churches? We'll have to hear more about this as our episodes continue. Jay Kim, pastoring in the mighty state of California. Both Jay and I both come from pastoral backgrounds, and we've got some great things lined up for you all in season 3.
Yeah, really excited about continuing conversations that we've been having for a couple of seasons now about spiritual formation. Benjamin, you already said it. We're really trying to explore the deep sort of influence and impact that physical spaces have on our formational journeys, both individually and communally. On this season, we'll explore specific ideas about worship and embodiment. Lots of practical conversations too about how to think intentionally about architecture and space and beauty and aesthetic as church leaders, even if we're sort of on a budget. So all three of us really excited to dive deeper together. And we've said it since the beginning, this podcast is just one sort of small part of a much larger offering of resources we hope are really helpful to you, our listener. So Sarah Joy, I know we've got a whole suite of resources that we're offering our folks this year.
Yeah, definitely. So if our listeners want to check out those resources, they can go to Barna, BARNA.com/making space. That's where you'll find all those resources. So we're going to jump into talking about this first interview of the season. Ben, I know you got to sit down with David Kinnaman. Is there anything you want to tell us about that interview or what stood out to you?
This interview with David Kinnaman, oh my goodness, just an interesting and inspiring conversation. David Kinnaman is the author, best-selling books such as Faith for Exiles, Good Faith, You Lost Me, and Unchristian. And of course, he's the CEO of the Barna Group. And since 1995, David has directed interviews with more than 2 million individuals
Wow.
and overseen thousands of U.S. and global research studies. He lives in Fort Worth, Texas. Great place. I've been there. Has 3 children, and I'll tell you this, just an all-round nice guy. David is a nice guy. And before we press play on that conversation, I'd love to open up just a couple of talking points and discussion points here of what we got into in this talk. For listeners, you'll hear us talk about our personal connection with church buildings. We both talk about our upbringing as pastors' kids and our personal sense of connection with just the spaces that make up church facilities. Sarah Joy, what is your personal background? Were you raised in the church? What's your personal connection with church buildings?
Yeah, well, I was raised in the church, and I have some very distinct memories as a little girl in church. And one of those most distinct memories is the first church that I remember attending. I was probably about 3 years old, and it had bright red carpet. And that stands out to me so much. And I just loved going on Sundays to be in the space with the bright red carpet. And I remember running up that center aisle and getting up on the stage after the church service was over and, jumping off to see if I could fly, those sorts of things. But it was such a formative experience for me, even as a young girl, just remembering that space and how much joy it brought me. And I looked forward to it every Sunday, being in there and getting to be, on the red carpet.
Come on, Jay. Were you even raised in the church if you didn't have red carpet and a center aisle
I know,
you could
exactly.
run down as a kid?
No, that's it. Yeah, the red carpet. I've never heard someone call it the red carpet of the church, but
Oh, there was green too, Jay. There was green, right?
Yeah,
There
and
was
in the
green.
90s, we got into the mauve,
Yeah.
yeah, lots of puke. You know what's really interesting, though, is I even listened to you talk about it, Sarah Joy. It's almost like when you smell certain smells and then the rush of nostalgia, you
Yeah.
know? And I think church kids, I know not everyone listening was someone who grew up in the church, but I was, you were. And yeah, even though, we grew up in very different churches, there is that sort of universal thread of the nostalgia that comes with all the good and the bad of our church upbringings.
Right.
But the space holds a certain type of nostalgia. I can almost feel myself in the building, even as I'm listening to you talk about it, which is such a beautiful reminder to me of
beautiful.
just, something we often forget in the digital age, especially like we're embodied humans who experience all of life in embodied ways, which means we experience all of life in spaces, like literally within spaces. So, I got to think about it more, but certainly the church spaces I inhabited as a kid have formed me as well. And the church space at the church where I'm on staff looks nothing like the churches I went to.
Bring
as
it
a
back,
kid,
Jay.
but,
Bring back the red carpet.
I know, red carpets. I might have to tell our elders it's red carpet time.
Your church will explode in growth. Hey, another point that David and I talked about. Jay, I would love your thoughts on this. David talked about learning environments and just kind of gave some, honest, reflective feedback on church spaces. Like, how conducive are these spaces really to learning and growing? And I know your ministry, Jay, you're an author, you have a scholarly approach. I know that the learning component would be important to you as a senior pastor. What are some of your reflections on just church spaces as it relates to learning environments?
Yeah, I mean, to be really honest, Benjamin, I'm pretty excited to hear what Dave has to say about it. There's, not that there's a real tension, but I am a little bit conflicted sometimes because I both equally desire that our people learn the way of Jesus, but then also embody and live the way of Jesus, which especially in the context of the church means belonging to a family. And I'm just, I'm not as well studied on it. I've got to give it more thought. But when I think about learning environments spatially and sort of belonging environments spatially, they look different to me in my mind.
Yes.
Even the way, for example, the way you would, the whole thing about like rows or circles kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think they're both important. Rows help us focus and sort of collectively fix our gaze in one direction to learn and to receive. But then circles are where we really belong. So, I mean, in a real literal physical way, we try to create both of those environments. But yeah, I'm really interested to see what Dave has to say. Sarah Jo, I'd be curious to know sort of your thoughts as a consultant who has seen broadly local churches. How do you see that balance playing out?
Yeah, one of the things, it's almost a question that comes to mind that I'm going to pitch back to you all in terms of thinking about components of a learning environment. So often, especially like in educational settings, they're set up in such a way that people learn differently, right? So people are some kind of getting it visually, audially, all of that type of thing. And so thinking about what are churches doing that can provide meeting different types of learning styles for people who are engaging at the church, and I think that that's one thing when I talk with churches, I do bring in those things of, how do you bring in sight and sound and smell and all of these things that really make us whole human beings and be able to take in what's being presented to us. I can't say I've figured out exactly how that all works and weaves itself together, but I really challenge churches to think about that and think about the different types of learners, the different types of people, the different ways that we can engage with them beyond just the, hearing the sermon or things like that.
You make a great point there, Sarah Joy. And indeed, there are so many different learning styles to consider in terms of how we take in information and how we grow. And David has some really great insight on that. And you'll also hear in this interview, David talk about a hunger that in spite of our limitations and budget constraints with church facilities, that our true north needs to remain a prayer for the manifest presence of God, that God would once again fill our human spaces and buildings, regardless of decor and design, and maybe where, our church layouts aren't 100% conducive to what we want to do. The presence of God is what we earnestly seek in our churches and in our gatherings and in our spaces. And I know it really impacted me. So, hey, without further ado, let's go ahead now and get to this conversation with David Kinnaman. So, David, you and I have quite a lot in common. We're both pastors' kids. For me, when I think of my upbringing, I actually remember the church buildings that my dad would preach in. And I would play with, of all things, something else that's close to your heart. I would play with Lego on the carpet in the front row. And it's interesting for me looking back because I feel like I can spot how my journey kind of intersects with these physical environments. And that's what we're talking about. Church buildings, church space, church facilities. I know that this is something that's, so important to your heart with the Making Space podcast. What's your personal connection when it comes to church spaces, church buildings, church facilities? What do they mean to you personally?
Well, I can remember this sort of series of events in my early life, going between my dad's non-denominational church in Phoenix, Arizona, that had pews, but it was sort of an interesting environment, and of course the worship was particularly oriented around kind of a charismatic style of worship. And then my grandparents went to a Lutheran church, Missouri Synod Lutheran Church in Southern California. We would go and visit, and the stained glass and the high ceilings and the architecture and sort of the ways in which those had pews with kneelers where you could fold down the tiny kneelers. I thought that was the coolest little contraption, and I think you're right. I hadn't thought until you had asked me that question that I can still remember certain smells and certain, the sort of the color of the upholstery or the various built elements in some of the worship spaces. And growing up as a pastor's kid, they were very formative, as much as a formative environment as my home and as my school would have been. And I think that was probably part of my early experience in terms of how built spaces might, create friendships. And I sort of feel like I was socialized in the church foyer. I remember, being there until the very last person had gone, except for our family. So I learned, how to socialize with watching my dad and mom, kind of work the room in the foyer before and after church. So I think these built spaces certainly have formed me.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. I mean, just this week I was talking to my kids, 3 boys, because, oh my goodness, Lord help us, we went to 2 church services on a Sunday. And they're like, oh my goodness, it's so many church services. I'm like, you have no idea. We were constantly in church buildings growing up, and it develops an affinity to those buildings. I think on a deeper level, for me then pastoring, and I know with your expertise with Barna, I'm so interested to hear your thoughts on this, but it would seem to be that there is something of our theology that is either shaped by our physical spaces, or maybe are at least reflected and expressed by our physical spaces. And they do seem to say a lot, our church buildings, about our beliefs, about God, about laity, clergy, to use that expression, our belief about community and what brings us together. When you look at the church landscape and you look at the data, and we've got some great data in the various journals, the Making Space journals that we've released on this, but when you just look at that broader picture, what needs to change in our thinking and practice when it comes to church facilities and church spaces? And if you would, start in the parking lot. Like, hop out of your car on a Sunday and just walk us through observations. What's working? What do you look at and go, maybe we should revisit what we do in terms of those areas?
Well, I think the first thing we should notice is really about some of the changing generational perspectives on space as well. In fact, our work with Aspen and on the Making Space series is something that we've been doing now for just about a decade. We started with a Making Space for Millennials project that was sort of very first of its kind data journalism project for Barna. We even did some visual polling where we asked people questions around the, sort of like 4 different pictures of an interior of a building, and 4 different pictures of sort of sacred iconography and various things, altar space, et cetera. So I think we were at some early stages of understanding that different generations, at least for our work, different generations were approaching space in a different way. And even the nature of attire and fashion, workspaces. I'm actually coming to you from a WeWork space in Fort Worth, Texas, and the notion of this studio space that we've made. That's all such a new idea. Part of it, of course, is coming out of COVID, and the idea of space is so important. But I think there is something about this larger trend that younger generations have more aesthetic sensibility, not than like any previous generation in human history, or that there aren't older generation members who like aesthetics and who've built beautiful spaces. I mean, I was in Washington, D.C. last week, and just in the National Gallery of Art, and that building was built in the early 1900s or in the 30s, and it's just an absolute beautiful building. And so there has been a sense of aesthetics and built spaces for centuries. In fact, we don't build things like they used to, right? So it's not that millennials are reinventing, design and aesthetics. It's just that there is a special emphasis in our younger generations around space. And so I think we should be paying attention to that. And I think that's the first thing to notice, is that people of all ages are coming with a different set of expectations. And in some ways you can't work just to impress them, because they've seen it all and they've experienced it all. But there has to be a real cohesiveness to the way these human bodies of ours come into a space, from the parking lot all the way to the foyer and into a sacred worship space, and contemplating all of those stages in the journey, and many more things to say about that. But I think this notion that generations are primed right now for picturing their workspace, their living space, their worship spaces, their play spaces, to have something of transcendence or something that feels cohesive to the purposes for which they're there.
I want to come back to that word, transcendence, but as a moment of commentary on what you just said. I think it's so important that when we talk about design aesthetics for younger generations, because it's so true. Like, you see it everywhere in society. This is broader than just a church thing. I think it's really important perhaps for older generations to note, or just for all of us to note, it's less about, oh, that looks cool, and therefore a younger person would be drawn to it. It's that the design communicates a language and a culture and a set of values, and they're resonating with the values that they see, not just, oh, I like that particular design. It's the language that it speaks to them. You use the word transcendence, and for church leaders, design committees within churches right now, say, for example, I'm a part of a design committee. I've been tasked with, we've got a refurbishment or a new build. How do we bring then the best from historic Christianity and blend it with the changing world that you're talking about?
Well, let's start at something that I think is maybe a starting point for some of my thinking on space and design. And this is, I'm passionate about a lot of subjects. Research it allows me to be interested in a lot of different topics, and I'm especially and particularly passionate about design, architecture. I think if I weren't a researcher, I would be an architect. And there's a little bit of research architecture and architecture in the research, and sort of almost like an idea architect. So I love this conversation. We could talk for a long time on all this. So one thing that occurred to me, I had a chance of traveling to the UK in the fall. I try to go at least once a year just because I love the architecture and design and other things in the UK. I got a chance to travel with some friends, Derek and Elena and Jory and Tony and the whole gang, Livia. It was a fun trip. And one thing we talked about, because the purpose of that trip was in part to sort of take a look at some church architecture spaces and to think about some of these themes that we've been researching alongside Aspen. And, there's one real clear reality in the church in North America, and I think in really the churches of the West, is that we have a discipleship problem. More people are touched by the message of Jesus than actually become disciples in our societies. And so one of the questions we could ask ourselves is, why is that the case? And one thing that occurred to us as we were traveling together, and again, this notion of kind of reflecting on space and built spaces, is that we partly have a discipleship problem because we don't have spaces that allow us to disciple people in the kind of learning environments that allow them to be transformed and to experience a transcendent Jesus. And the way I would say that, my friend Derek talks a little bit about like how he's an architect, and so he talks about the notion that architects design specific spaces for the amount of time that you want a human body to be comfortable in that space. So if you're in a train station or an airport, you'll notice that the chairs have arms because we don't want people, sitting too long. We want them to be just comfortable enough for, a 45-minute layover, but we don't want them to be there for 4.5 hours. It's why when you go to an airport lounge, the seating and the space is designed for business travelers who are more, they've got to do phone calls and have a meal and do different things inside of an airport lounge. And if we're being honest with ourselves, we've really engineered and architected a lot of our church spaces as these sort of 90-minute transitory spaces where we're really happy to have you on campus for 90 minutes, but we're ready for you to be done when we're done. And again, I'm sort of saying that with a bit of a tongue in cheek, but there's this sense in which we have a discipleship problem because we have a built space problem. We haven't imagined our spaces, I believe, in ways that are consistent with the way human beings live and breathe and have their sort of essence today. So like, Starbucks, lots and lots of social analysis on Starbucks in North America as creating a sort of third space, not quite work, not quite home. And, many churches have done great jobs. They've got wonderful foyers and, cafes and coffee shops and sort of spaces for things to happen. But I think we're at the front end of a real rethinking of how to imagine spaces. I mean, I think on that trip to the UK, we went and visited a beautiful old building called Saint in Hackney in London, and they had a whole side room that was just designated as a place of prayer. They had an LED floor and an LED ceiling indicating places where people could come into this space to pray, for a specific location. They were praying for Ukraine on that day, and sort of like the skies of Ukraine and the skies of London could intersect. And there was a real intentionality to create a kind of sacred space exactly adjacent to the worship auditorium, and it was a place of prayer. You see in the page of scripture this phrase, this notion of like a place of prayer. They went down to the place of prayer, and I actually think even just having not just like the prayer room that's sort of like off to the side and it smells like some of our ancestors were buried inside of it. We could actually have really beautiful places to experience prayer that aren't just the worship sanctuary. And so I think we have so many things to say about this. Like, as I said, it's pretty passionate about it, but I think there are ways for us to take really simple steps towards the kinds of ways that we want human bodies to come into these spaces, to pray, to interact with each other, to have food, to rest, to provide comfort and solace and resources to the poor and homeless of our communities, to worship together, to sit and learn. I think that's actually another huge area of the potential future for the church, is thinking about our pedagogical muscles and models, and how do we think about sort of reinventing sort of the classroom experience, or the kind of place where you experience more content, not just in a kind of a sermon way, but in a Christian education way. By the way, that brings to mind, there was this actual hero of faith that we sometimes forget, named Henrietta Mears, who was hugely influential in Dawson Trotman, Billy Graham, Bill Bright, many of the great sort of leaders of North American Christianity. But Henrietta Mears was a Bible school teacher, a Sunday school teacher. She was a huge proponent of Sunday school. And Ben, she had more than 4,000 people attending her Sunday school every weekend at Hollywood Presbyterian in Los Angeles. And that sort of model of Christian education, a woman who was teaching at Hollywood Presbyterian, this really remarkable lady. She started Gospel Light, a publishing company. She had a huge impact on, as I said, sort of the lives of some pretty well-known, prominent leaders. And just this notion of like, it wasn't just about sermon making, it was about creating an educational arm of the church through Sunday school. Well, what if we had a whole new wave of sort of thinking about sort of Christian education as inherently baked into our spaces at local churches? So I think there's a huge amount of opportunities for us, and this notion of really imagining how do human bodies experience a space and begin to see all that the church can and should be, in part because of how the space is oriented. It's a huge opportunity for us.
Yeah, just some wonderful thoughts there, David. Thank you for sharing that. You talk about reimagining that human experience in space. And so, maybe we're just getting the exact results, like in a very literal sense, we are getting the exact results that our church facilities are built for. And I mean, if you're an alien and you dropped, into a church building and you're asked, well, what is this space? Describe it. Okay, maybe you're not an alien. Use any other example. You know what I'm saying? You're not familiar with church.
I could be.
You dropped into a church.
I'm an android.
You're an android. Would we not, if we're honest for the most part, say, oh, this is a concert hall because you have 1,000 chairs facing a stage? And I'm not saying that in the sense of, I've been a pastor for over 20 years. I'm well aware of the practical realities and constraints of you are accommodating and ministering to a public venue. And so I get that. There's not necessarily easy solutions to it, but just addressing it and recognizing there is something about this physical environment that communicates something, and it does shape and form something, and it's not necessarily the most conducive to, as you talked about, learning environments. I thought that was, just so well said, where you talk about those kind of secondary spaces that can be helpful. So an example for me, David, there is a mall. I mean, you mentioned the UK. That's totally fine. I was hoping you'd mention Australia. No problem. I'm not insulted. But in Australia, there is a mall near me, $500 million, brand new mall, right? This thing is beautiful. You know what's interesting about it? Not many retail stores. You're talking sitting areas, gardens, restaurants, cafes, food. And I stepped back and looked at that and thought this totally makes sense because the world has changed. You can't compete with Amazon for price, but you do have an advantage that says, come and spend time in our environment. Meet your friends here. You talked about the third space idea. Come and connect. I mean, you're going to spend money if you're there for long enough. And yet church buildings, I think when I look at my own upbringing, have become or were seen as so functional, like get as many people into an auditorium as what you can. And again, I totally understand that. How can we make spaces more human, David?
Well, I think that's first partly the purpose of this making space collaboration that Barna has with Aspen and many other thought leaders and with you, Ben, is that we're trying to ask that question because I don't think that's a simple answer. And, going back to that example you gave a few minutes ago, if you're on a committee that's, designed to try to rethink space in your church, you're going to be dealt a certain hand that, you can't play cards that aren't in your hand. So you've got to look at your existing reality, the mission and vision of what you're trying to accomplish, the budget. You will have a certain square footage or a certain set of design parameters. We can't all go build the National Gallery of Art. Like that whole plot of land was rezoned and gifted by Roosevelt, FDR, to Mellon, the philanthropist who basically gave example. I'm gonna give you all my art, but you got to let me have a building for it in Washington D.C. and the National Mall. So like you're not gonna get rezoned space in your city without paying money for it. So I think there's some design parameters. So we should certainly ask ourselves what are some of the minimal things we could do that, again, given our efforts here, could we make a different experience? So I'm on the board at a certain university, and there's a small little prayer chapel. It's been there for a long time. It's called the Rose of Sharon Chapel. I think Sharon might have been buried underneath it because it smells inside. They've got all these beautiful buildings for science and administration and library, but it's an ugly old building that needs at least a paint job. And Sharon doesn't smell like a rose anymore. So we were walking by it, and I was like, guys, what would it take? Could I come paint that thing, right? And they're like, well, I mean, you're a board member. We don't, it's like, well, there's got to be some other ways to do this. And so, I'm much love to my friends at the university. But the notion is, could we take a fresh look and actually, doing some focus groups with some millennials or Gen Zers or some people that have a real eye for design and imagining, instead of starting with the question of like, well, we really can't do this. These are the cards we have. We do have to understand there are certain things we can and can't do. But what if we just brought some non-believers or brought some people who are just really fun and interesting to listen to and say, what do you think of our space? What can we do differently? And, help us to imagine a future. And by partnering with some really creative ideas and people, I bet you could come up with some fresh ways of thinking about that, and literally some paint and some artificial plants or some real plants could make a big difference. I was in a coffee shop recently, and it's a bit of a chain, small chain, but they actually had live plants in one of the walls there, and I was like, wow, that's cool. It was a fresh take on an interior decoration that actually made a difference in the aesthetics of the place. It didn't look as neat and tidy as a bunch of fake plants, but it actually was pretty cool. And so I just think this notion of acknowledging the hand you're dealt, asking for fresh perspective, imagining the use, asking God's presence to come into these spaces, super important. Like, God, you've done some things. If these walls could speak, they would tell many stories of the past. But now, Lord, we ask you to come again in these spaces to speak to us, to help us to educate and inspire. And I do think, let me just add this one thought, that I am not a very cynical person, and I have plenty of reason to be pretty cynical, as you might imagine, as a person who looks at the research about sort of the impact of Christianity in our society. I actually think God's doing some amazing things, pastors and leaders, and even when you choose the wrong color of paint, or even if you didn't notice the smell because you've been in the Rose of Sharon Chapel too many, you've tuned it out. Like, it's all good, but we're still responsible now for what God's calling us to next. And I think there is some real ways in which, even if we've made some, we had the budget for a church redesign, but we didn't quite do it the way it could have been done. That's all right. Like, God can still use some pretty interesting spaces, and He can still use our hearts after all. And we're broken, imperfect people. So I just think there's a real opportunity now for us to, look at our spaces with some fresh eyes, to most importantly ask God's presence to, come and visit with us in a manifest presence sort of way. God's presence is everywhere, but there is a way in which
Agreed.
His specific manifest experience can be more felt. It's why these church spaces matter so much. And so let's just ask God to continue to, enliven these places and to make them, fresh opportunities, fresh places of experiencing God in some profound ways.
Such a great reminder that, you may not have $5 million to go and build a retro cathedral that spills out to a coffee roastery in the foyer. But what a beautiful reminder. Thank you, David. Let's pray and believe for God's presence to fill our spaces and buildings. Thank you for sharing that. Hey, quick last question, just on a personal level. What's like a recent space you've walked into and you're like, this feels good? Can't be a church building, can't be a college, can't be a research bunker, because everybody knows don't you live in a research bunker? Can't be a research bunker. Where have you walked into and you're like, oh no, this feels like home. I dig this. This is cool.
Well, I moved to Fort Worth, Texas about 2 years ago, and there is a really great little sort of riverside cafe. They call it Press Cafe. Inside, outside seating. It's right kind of on a riverbank. It's really not much of a river, but it's really pretty darn cool for us Texans. And it reminds me of California, which is a place that I've lived for a long time. And just they've got little space heaters, and there's bikes, and there's people doing yoga and kids, and they do a little kind of Saturday morning farmers market. It's a real place of a lot of people, a lot of walks of life, a lot of things happening. So I think that's been a space that's been pretty inspirational. I'll go down and meet for coffee or meet for breakfast or have drinks with some friends, or take a bike ride from that sort of launch point. But it is, I think, a space that provides this sort of there are trees and greenery and outdoor space, but there's also some inside space and some food. And it's my new home, and it's been a really place where the Lord's met me in some very special ways. New friends have been formed there. I've learned to trust God even in these new spaces in my life, and so that's what comes to mind. The trailhead at Trinity River.
It sounds wonderful, and I'm looking forward to our time together there, having coffee and doing yoga together over lunch. It sounds fantastic. In all seriousness,
I'll let you do the yoga. I'll do the bike ride.
In all seriousness, David Kinnaman, thank you so much for all that you've done in terms of stirring our imagination towards what the future can look like in terms of church space and facilities. Thank you so much on a broader level, and thank you for this conversation today.
Well, thanks, Ben. Likewise, thanks for being a host of this great podcast, and thanks to all the team behind the scenes, Lauren and Joe and Elena and Derek and so many others who have been working so hard on making space. And also thanks to all the people who have contributed their voice, whether as experts or as people who have ideas, and then especially those that we interview. I mean, our business wouldn't exist without people giving their opinions. And sometimes they're uncomfortable for us to deal with, but I think there is an opportunity for us to really listen well to what people are telling us. I think asking for people's feedback about our built spaces can be tough, just like it's almost like asking for people to give us feedback on our attire or our fashion or our faces. So like, how can you say something, constructive, but I think asking for people's feedback about these places where we live, work, and worship is so important, and being open and honest and not defensive. And it's hard if your spouse picked out the color, or if you picked out the color. But I think this is one thing I keep learning in research, is that the privilege it is to ask somebody their opinion, and not to judge it, but to say, can you just share with us what you really think? And sometimes that's really, really hurt. I know for me personally, as a Christian leader, or as a parent, or as a friend to many pastors, like, wow, that would be hard to handle. And so I know as a leader, you've been dealing with, you're basically like the opinion box, aren't you, as a pastor, as a leader? So how can you steel yourself in a non-cynical way to respond to what people have to say? And I think that's one of the jobs of leadership in our time. And it's our pleasure at Barna to help you listen well to people's opinions and then to make your very best decisions on the basis of that.
David Kinnaman, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Making Space podcast. Quick reminder, we have a whole suite of practical resources to offer you as you think about space in your church, from journals to some new upcoming publications in the year ahead. So to learn more, make sure you check out barna.com/making space. If you've been encouraged or learned something new today, we would so love it if you would leave a rating or review and share this with a friend or a church staff. And we'll catch you next time on the Making Space podcast.